So this video is going to be about Roman slavery, and we're going to start off with a small introduction. Slavery began to be an important factor in Roman life in the period from 350 to 272 BCE, when Rome began to expand into central and southern Italy. The period of the first two Punic Wars, 262 to 201 BCE, marked a greater increase in the number of slaves taken from the areas of the western part of the Mediterranean. After that, an increasing number of slaves came from the eastern Mediterranean.
Here we have our content, which are four questions we're going to answer. The first one would be who were the slaves? Then we would talk about what would slaves do? Then what was life like for slaves? And lastly, could slaves be freed? So who were the slaves? Most slaves were prisoners of war who were captured in war. New ones could also be obtained through natural reproduction among the existing slaves' populations, the exposure of infants, piracy, kidnapping by robbers, the sale of one's child or of oneself. A long-distance trade with communities beyond the frontiers. Slaves were usually bought and sold on the market, and the price of a highly educated slave would cost $120,000 in today's prices. A trained farm worker would slightly more than $10,000. Desired attributes included beauty, strength, education, and special skills. The contract usually stipulated a no-return policy except for epilepsy.
So, what would slaves do? Slaves did much of the work on the farm and in the trades in the growing numbers of businesses. Slaves worked as unskilled laborers, mechanics, artisans, carpenters, bricklayers, seamen, and assistants to merchants and shopkeepers. Many slaves from Greece and the Near East were more knowledgeable than their masters because of their backgrounds and early education. They became the teachers, doctors, musicians, actors, and bookkeepers in Roman society. Although educated and skilled slaves were given much personal freedom, they were still the master's property and could be bought and sold at will. Wealthy Romans kept large number of slaves, many of whom had specialized tasks in the household. One slave might be in charge of polishing the silver, another of writing letters, and another of announcing the guests or the hour of the day. Great landholders sometimes had hundreds of slaves on their estates, where they tended to their herds and did the work of growing grapes, olives, and wheat.
So what was life like for slaves? The lives that slaves led different, greatly depending on who owned them and what kind of work they did. Some owners felt affections for their slaves and treated them humanely. Perhaps they also thought it was a good idea to take care of their investment. Other owners abused their slaves by beating them, torturing them, and even killing them. The masters had the legal right to kill a slave, but naturally was rarely inclined to do so, because he would be destroying his own property. Whipping was a common punishment for minor offenses. Other more feared punishments were to send a slave to the mines or bakeries where the work was much harder.
Could slaves be freed? There never was an attempt to abolish slavery in Rome. Even former slaves did nothing to eliminate slavery and were themselves sometimes slave owners. But it is known that Rome was unique among slave-owning societies in that large slaves were regularly manumitted. If this was done following certain formalities, the ex-slave became a Roman citizen, although some public offices were closed to them. A freed man or freed woman's child had at least in theory the same opportunities as other freeborn citizens.
Most slaves were given allowances, and the thrifty slave could hope to save enough over the course of several years to buy their own freedom. Masters often granted freedom or released the slave out of gratitude for services rendered. Others freed the slaves in their wills and left them sums of money to begin their new lives.
That was it for our video about slavery in Rome. Thank you for listening.